I never thought a simple doormat could change my life, but then the HOA slapped me with a $500 fine, all because it didn't fit the community aesthetic. At first I laughed it off, thinking it was just another petty rule, but the more they pushed, the more I realized this wasn't about a mat, it was about control, humiliation, and power. Every email, every notice felt like a personal attack, and then I decided enough was enough. What I did next didn't just shock the HOA, it turned the tables in a way nobody in my neighborhood could have predicted. Would they ever see it coming? I had always loved my little corner of Maplewood Estates. Nestled on a quiet cul-de-sac, our home was modest but cozy, with a small garden my wife and I tended every weekend. Neighbors waved as they walked by, kids played on the sidewalks, and life felt peaceful, almost idyllic. I was the kind of homeowner who kept the grass trimmed, the mailbox polished, and never minded lending a hand when someone needed it. We weren't flashy, but we took pride in our home. A bright red doormat with a cheerful welcome had been sitting by our door for years. Nothing flashy, just a small touch of personality in a neighborhood where conformity was prized. It never seemed to matter. Until it did. The HOA had always been around, of course, sending newsletters, reminders, and occasional friendly notes about community standards, but I'd never been personally targeted. That all changed the week I found an official letter tucked into my mailbox. The envelope was thick, intimidating, and stamped with the HOA's logo. I tore it open, expecting maybe a routine notice. What I read instead made my stomach drop. $500 fine for my doormat. It sounded absurd, even ridiculous. But the message was clear: someone was watching, someone had decided that our small act of individuality was unacceptable. Little did I know, that tiny piece of fabric at my doorstep would ignite a battle that would consume my quiet life and expose the darker side of neighborhood politics. Even in those first moments I could feel the tension building, though I had no idea just how far the HOA and one particularly relentless neighbor would go to enforce their vision of perfection. After receiving the initial $500 fine for my doormat, I thought it was a one-time overreach. Surely if I explained the situation politely, the HOA would understand. I drafted a careful email, citing the neighborhood guidelines and pointing out that the doormat was tasteful, small, and harmless. I even attached photos showing how neat and unobtrusive it looked. I hit send with a flicker of hope, thinking this would be the end of it. Instead, the retaliation began. Within 3 days, another letter arrived, this time more formal, almost aggressive in tone. The HOA board emphasized that my mat violated aesthetic uniformity standards using phrases like community integrity and visual compliance. They demanded immediate removal, threatening additional fines if ignored. $500 felt absurd, but the looming threat of $1,000 or more made my stomach knot. I could almost hear their smug satisfaction, as if they enjoyed wielding this strange authority. Then came the neighbor complaints. I had always gotten along with most of the street, but one woman, let's call her Karen, took a peculiar interest in enforcing HOA rules like a personal crusade. I spotted her glaring from across the street as I watered my garden, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes on every minor imperfection she could find. Trash cans slightly askew, a garden gnome out of place, even my carefully pruned roses became a target. Her presence felt suffocating, like the walls of the community were closing in. Within a week, I was receiving multiple notices. One claimed that my mailboxes were too modern compared to the neighborhood style. Another accused me of leaving gardening tools visible in the backyard, which supposedly violated community standards of tidiness. Each notice carried fines that escalated incrementally, adding stress I never anticipated from a quiet suburban life. By this point, the $500 doormat fine felt like just the first ripple of a tidal wave. I tried reasoning again. I visited the HOA office armed with documentation, photos, and polite arguments. The receptionist listened politely but said nothing could be done without board approval. I requested a meeting with the board, but the emails went unanswered, the phone calls unreturned. Frustration built, and with it, a sense of helplessness. It wasn't just about the mat anymore, it was about being treated like an offender in my own home. Then, subtle harassment began in earnest. Karen would show up unexpectedly during yard work, scrutinizing every corner of my property. Her neighbors whispered their judgments, some clearly siding with her. Even friendly conversations at the mailbox became awkward, with curious eyes silently weighing my compliance with every obscure HOA rule. I started waking up in the middle of the night, imagining new fines, new complaints, wondering what Karen would target next. The legal gray area became apparent when I consulted a community lawyer. He explained that while HOAs had authority to enforce certain rules, Fines had to be reasonable and there had to be documented violations, not subjective complaints about aesthetic taste. My heart lifted slightly, realizing that the power the HOA wielded wasn't absolute, but just as I began to see a way forward, the HOA issued another notice. They were taking my case to a formal hearing. Public, humiliating, and designed to intimidate me. By this point, every interaction in my neighborhood carried tension. I noticed neighbors subtly recording my yard, photographing my doors as if waiting for another excuse to file complaints. Mail slots were stuffed with reminder letters, each one feeling like an accusation rather than communication. I tried maintaining my daily routines, keeping my lawn trimmed, watering the garden, being polite, but nothing seemed enough. The very idea of living peacefully in my own home had become impossible. One afternoon I received an official notice that sent my stress into overdrive. The HOA was escalating the fine, now totaling $1,200, with threats of lien placement on my property. I stared at the paper, disbelief mixing with simmering anger. This wasn't about a doormat anymore. This was about control, humiliation, and a relentless desire to assert power. Karen had succeeded in turning the HOA into her personal weapon, and my quiet life had been transformed into a battleground. The day of the HOA hearing arrived like a storm on the horizon. I had prepared meticulously, compiling every document, every email, every photograph that proved my doormat and my conduct had been entirely reasonable. Still walking into that sterile meeting room, I felt a rush of tension I hadn't anticipated. The room was arranged like a courtroom, a long table for the board members, folders neatly stacked, glares as sharp as knives. Karen was there too, sitting at the edge with her signature smug smirk, clearly thrilled to witness my public reckoning. The hearing began with the board reading a prepared statement, a laundry list of supposed infractions, the doormat, the modern mailbox, the garden tools allegedly left in plain view. Each item felt like a personal attack. As they droned on, my anger simmered. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was about control, humiliation, and the audacity of someone thinking they could dictate every detail of my life. I kept my voice calm, but my hands clenched into fists under the table. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out my case methodically. I cited community rules verbatim, pointing out their vagueness and the inconsistent enforcement. I presented photographs, emails, and even legal references showing that fines of this magnitude were excessive and, in many cases, unenforceable. I watched as the faces of some board members shifted, subtle but unmistakable cracks in their composed facades. Karen's smirk faltered slightly, but only for a moment. She leaned forward, ready to pounce with another accusation, but I was prepared. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, a procedural technicality that rendered their $500 fine and the subsequent threats invalid. It was buried deep in the HOA's own bylaws, a line about reasonable notice and opportunity to correct alleged violations. My lawyer had spotted it, and now I presented it with precision. The room went silent. Board members whispered nervously among themselves, shuffling papers. Karen's jaw tightened, the smugness had drained from her face, replaced with disbelief. The tension was electric. I could feel the weight of every neighbor's gaze, each person silently taking sides. I spoke clearly, passionately, pointing out not just the absurdity of targeting a simple doormat, but the broader implications of unchecked power in our community. My words echoed in the room, a call for fairness, for boundaries, for respect. I had transformed from a beleaguered homeowner into a voice of reason, standing against the petty tyranny that had invaded our quiet street. As the hearing drew to a close, the board reluctantly acknowledged the error. The fine was rescinded, and any record of the violation was erased. Karen tried one last attempt to assert dominance, but her complaints fell flat in the face of documented facts and legal clarity. The moment of vindication was complete, the tension that had gripped me for weeks snapped like a stretched rope, finally breaking. Walking out of that room, I felt a rush of triumph mixed with disbelief. The neighborhood had watched, the HOA had been challenged, and the scales had finally tipped in my favor. Karen's expression as I left was one of silent fury, a clear acknowledgement that her campaign of control had failed spectacularly. Walking back into my home after the hearing felt surreal. The air seemed lighter, the usual tension of the neighborhood softened, almost as if my victory had shifted the atmosphere itself. The doormat sat where it had always been, cheerful and unassuming, yet now it symbolized more than a simple greeting. It was a quiet testament to standing one's ground, to refusing to allow arbitrary power to dictate the rhythm of everyday life. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the gnawing fear of another notice or a surprise visit from Karen. The immediate impact was tangible. The HOA, once a looming authority over our quiet street, had been reminded of the limitations of their power. Notices and fines ceased, meetings became less intimidating, and the subtle scrutiny from neighbors eased. Some approached me with cautious congratulations, others with veiled admiration for having challenged the status quo. The whispers and glances that had filled my days with anxiety were replaced by nods, greetings, and a newfound respect. It was a transformation not just in my life, but in the dynamics of the entire community. Karen, however, did not vanish. She lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, her expression a careful mask of civility when we crossed paths. But even she seemed changed. Her attacks became less frequent, her complaints dwindled, and the audacity she had wielded so confidently was tempered, if not entirely subdued. It was a subtle victory, one that didn't require confrontation but relied on the undeniable truth: the rules could be questioned, challenged, and, when abused, held in check. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small, almost imperceptible shifts around the neighborhood. Other homeowners, emboldened by my experience, began questioning petty fines and unnecessary restrictions themselves. One neighbor even asked me for advice after receiving a trivial violation notice. The sense of isolation I had felt during the harassment was replaced by a sense of solidarity. Our street, once defined by fear of scrutiny, began to feel like a community where personal expression, even something as simple as a doormat, was no longer subject to intimidation. But the experience left deeper marks as well. I realized how fragile the balance of power can be in suburban life. A single overly zealous neighbor and a complicit HOA could impose weeks of stress, anxiety, and tension over something utterly trivial. It made me more vigilant, not paranoid, but aware. I began documenting every communication, every notice, and keeping a careful record of the HOA's interactions, not because I anticipated trouble, but because knowledge and preparation are the strongest shields against arbitrary authority. Emotionally, the journey reshaped me. There were moments of helplessness so profound I could barely sleep, moments when the thought of simply giving up seemed tempting. But the decision to fight, to persist despite the ridicule and the mounting pressure, reinforced a lesson that extended far beyond neighborhood rules. Sometimes, standing up for yourself is less about the object in question, the doormat, and more about asserting the dignity, respect, and autonomy every individual deserves. The legal lesson was equally important. I had learned that HOAs, while granted authority, operate within limits. Rules must be clear, enforcement must be consistent, and fines must be reasonable. By challenging the overreach, I had not only secured my own victory but also demonstrated that compliance is not blind obedience. It is accountability that ensures fairness. Socially, the victory rippled outward. My story became a quiet legend on our street, shared cautiously among neighbors who recognized the absurdity of the conflict and the power of standing firm. Some were inspired to question their own compliance, others simply felt relief knowing that an overzealous HOA could be challenged successfully. It was a subtle shift, but meaningful, a rebalancing of respect and power that made the neighborhood feel more humane, less rigid, and more supportive of individual expression. Reflecting on the experience, I realized the profound psychological toll these disputes can have. Weeks of harassment, scrutiny, and intimidation created anxiety that didn't vanish immediately after the fine was rescinded. I had to rebuild a sense of normalcy, reminding myself that the street, the neighborhood, and even Karen's presence were no longer threats. The simple acts of tending my garden, placing the doormat, and stepping outside felt revolutionary once again. Each day became a quiet affirmation of resilience. There were practical takeaways too. I began attending HOA meetings with a critical eye, not to confront, but to understand the decision-making process and ensure transparency. I started advocating for clearer rules, fairer enforcement, and open communication, hoping to prevent future residents from facing the same absurd ordeal. My goal shifted from personal victory to systemic improvement, turning a negative experience into a proactive effort to protect the community from petty power plays. On a personal level, the ordeal strengthened my resolve and confidence. I discovered that measured persistence, grounded in facts and legality, can dismantle intimidation and overreach. I also learned the importance of emotional control. Allowing anger or frustration to dominate would have undermined my ability to navigate the situation effectively. Calm determination became my greatest ally, and in the end, it was far more powerful than any fine or accusation the HOA could throw at me. As weeks turned into months, life gradually returned to its quieter rhythm. The doormat remained, cheerful as ever, yet now carrying a story of quiet defiance. The neighborhood's subtle tension had eased, and my interactions with neighbors were lighter, warmer, and more genuine. Karen's occasional glances no longer carried the weight of authority or intimidation, they were simply reminders of a battle fought and won. Ultimately, the resolution revealed something deeper about human nature and community dynamics. Power, when unchecked, can become oppressive, even in the most ordinary of settings. Authority can be wielded punitively, often masking personal biases or petty vendettas. But resilience, knowledge, and a commitment to fairness can restore balance. In challenging the HOA, I had not only reclaimed my doormat but also reaffirmed a fundamental truth: no one should be made to feel powerless in their own home. Looking back, the experience taught me to appreciate the subtle freedoms of daily life. Walking past my garden, noticing the neighbors' children playing, seeing friendly waves and smiles, it all carried new meaning. Freedom of expression, personal dignity, and the quiet joys of homeownership were no longer taken for granted. Every small victory, every carefully maintained corner of my property, became a statement: I had endured, I had persisted, and I had prevailed. The story concludes not with a final confrontation, but with lasting impact: a community subtly changed, a homeowner empowered, and the assurance that standing up against petty authority is not just justified, but necessary. The doormat, once a source of absurd conflict, had become a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of one person refusing to be bullied. And as I looked out at the street from my porch, I couldn't help but reflect: if a simple doormat could spark such chaos, what else might be challenged in our lives? And how many battles, like mine, could be won with persistence, courage, and a refusal to accept injustice? The answers weren't easy, but one thing was clear: I would never underestimate the importance of standing my ground again,